Welcome to Season 3, Episode 10. I'm Jenna Jandro, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and I'm your host today. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format, so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat or Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Feel free to ask whenever the inquiry arises. However, I will only be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Moment of truth. What's she gonna do? Yay, I'm applauding myself. So today I'm speaking to the Historical Society's collection manager, Patrick Callaway, about the Maine that almost was, British plans for Down East Maine from 1775 to 1815. Patrick wrote about this topic in our 2022 edition of Chebacco, Imagining What If. Patrick Callaway, in addition to his collections work at the Historical Society, is a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Maine. He earned his PhD in Canadian American history at the University of Maine and was a Fulbright exchange student at Dalhousie in Halifax. His research focuses on the economic connections between the United States and British North American in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Welcome, Patrick. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
So your article focuses on two key turning points in history where the Down East area could easily have become a province of British North America. So tell me, what did British North America look like territory-wise in 1775?
Okay, so in 1775, right as the American Revolution is starting, British territory stretched everywhere from what we would now call Canada, all the way through the 13 colonies, west to the Mississippi River and to Spanish Louisiana, and including Florida. So pretty much everything on the eastern third of the North American continent was part of British America. British North America is a little bit of a later term that comes in after the Revolution. But for us up here in Maine, British North America is a pretty useful term, meaning New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, the Canadas, and points north.
Okay, so this map here shows a new and correct map, this is in quotes, of the British colonies in North America in 1794. So your article focuses on British and North American or American relations, but it does not focus on Indigenous communities at all. But there was obviously interactions between the British and the Americans and Indigenous groups. So we did want to recommend a resource here called We Were Not the Savages by Daniel N. Paul. He's a Mi'kmaq elder in Nova Scotia. And it does cover the history of the collision between European and Native American civilizations. And I'm 95% of my way through this book, and it's a really illuminating and insightful read. So when I read your article, I picked up on the British being really focused on Nova Scotia, and there were some details from that history that I related to, being in a kind of an Acadian outcast territory here in St. John Valley. So could you tell me a little bit more about the British in Nova Scotia?
Right, so the British claims to Nova Scotia go all the way back to the 1620s. So the original Alexander Grant. Really, they don't get their hands on the province itself in a physical way until after the turn of the 18th century. So in 1711, There's a treaty, and what we now call Nova Scotia goes over to the British. It is mostly settled by the Acadian, and thinly so, and Mi'kmaq and other First Nations persons. It is not until the development of Halifax in 1749 that we start to see a major British influence there. And the development of Halifax is a key to our story even in 1775 because Halifax represents a very important strategic asset in that it was a large naval base and is the only royal dockyard in that part of North America in 1775. So, for the British Navy, as the American Revolution is coming, that is one of the very few bases that they have on the western part of the Atlantic where they can go for repairs and to refit and rearm and all the things that a Navy at the time would need to do.
So it mentions in the article about in the mid 1700s, them being concentrated on Nova Scotia. And I mentioned, you mentioned, and I mentioned the Acadian or the Acadian. I'm in the St. John Valley right now, which is one of the areas that some Acadian descendants wound up after they had been displaced a couple of times. And so I loved connecting this MDI Down East story to this region that I'm in right now and that I was born in. So I was fascinated also by Castine's involvement in all of this. And I would love to hear more about that. And also if there's any landmarks in Castine that help tell this story in a real visual place-based way.
Right, so Castine is an important place as it is a protected deep water harbor on the Maine coast, which is a bit of a rarity. If we go back to colonial history in the 16 and early 1700s, the Penobscot River formed the de facto boundary between British settlement and land claims and French land claims. It was largely unsettled by Europeans. However, it was acknowledged as sort of that de facto borderland between the two empires. When the American Revolution comes, there's support for the American effort in Maine, generally speaking. However, as we get to 1779 and the war has started to move to the south, one of the important connections that still exists is between Halifax and New York. So, what Castine would be a safe water or safe deep water harbor for ships going back and forth between British bases in New York and Halifax to find refuge. Then part two to that is that a a relatively substantive portion of the American population supported the British during the Revolution. John Adams gives a figure of a third of all people supported the British. The numbers are hard to really come to grips with. After the war, about 4% of the entire population of the 13 colonies flees the country. So it is a substantive group of people. And over in London, they're trying to start figuring out what to do with these people. And one of the solutions that they run into is the development of a new colony from the Penobscot to the east, centered on Castine as a port and as a base for merchant and military trade, but of down east Maine being a new settlement called New Ireland. So it was in part a way to guard the land approaches to Nova Scotia. It was in part a way of rewarding loyalists for their service. It was in part a military venture to secure new territory and a new base. And all of those things come to rest on what was then called Bagaduce. Castine, as the name, doesn't come around till 1796. There are a number of physical artifacts, not only from 1779, but also the 1814 expedition that you'll find in Castine. The most prominent of them being Fort George. The original earthworks from that era still exist in town and are currently used as a community park.
Thank you. So what kept this or that region from becoming New Ireland versus New England?
Well, there's a couple of factors. The first is that settlement in the Castine area was relatively small. We're talking about hundreds of people rather than the thousands or tens of thousands. In 1783, when we start to have the mass evacuation of British troops and of British loyalists out of the colonies, most of them land in Nova Scotia. So instead of coming to what would have been disputed territory in Maine, they go to Nova Scotia. A lot of them end up in New Brunswick, which becomes its own province in 1784. Some will go up to Canada, others will go across the Atlantic. But coastal Maine was just not as attractive of a settlement from 1779 to 1783 as British authorities were hoping. In the treaty negotiations in 1783, one of the demands that John Adams put forward was that all territory belonging to Massachusetts would be part of the American nation and returned to Massachusetts. The British government, facing enormous wartime costs at the end of an extended revolution and an extended war, which expanded all the way out to Europe, to India, to the Caribbean, there simply was no support at home to go to war with the United States or remain at war with the United States over New Ireland. That was just a concession that they were willing to make in order to pursue other interests.
So how did Earl Shelburne play into the whole New Ireland venture?
So Shelburne is the British Prime Minister that comes in right at the end of the American Revolution. And he has a very different approach on what this new British Empire is going to look like without the 13 colonies. And his idea was that the United States should be supported as people who shared a common language, who shared many common ties of banking and of merchant activity, of cultural ties and economic ties, that a strong United States would end up being a bigger benefit to the empire than a smaller, more reduced United States. So this means he's willing to make land concessions that other British officials were not. So this means places like Eastern Maine. That's a concession he's willing to make. Or what we would now call the Ohio River country. So Ohio and the Old Northwest. That's a concession he's willing to make in order to secure good terms with the United States and to at least hope to try to rebuild some bridges back and forth between Great Britain and the new country. He is out of office soon after. It was a relatively weak government, and British politics at this time were heavily fractured. So it was not because of his generosity that he is removed from office, but it certainly doesn't help him politically.
So in addition to the American Revolutionary War's impact on the claims of this region, there was another Revolutionary War that came into play, which was the French Revolutionary War in 1792. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
So the French Revolution is in many ways much more ideologically driven than the American Revolution. So it is a much more radical type of revolution. And many elites, not only in the United States, but certainly the bulk of British opinion, was firmly against the French Revolution. It was seen as radical, as destructive of property, of destructive of peace, order, and good government. It was seen as something that was undesirable in British or American society. In British society, that support against the French Revolution remains relatively intact. There's a handful of figures on the radical end of politics that come out, but not anything substantive. In the United States, it is a key contributing factor to the development of two political parties. So in the 1790s, we see the development of the Federalist Party, which tended to be more pro-British and more conservative, and the Democratic Republicans, which tended to be more supportive of the French Revolution and more supportive of what was, quote, the common person. So, what we would call a more liberal party. So, this is a partisan divide, which to some degree we still see to this day, but it's a partisan divide that becomes more important with the election of Jefferson in 1800. The Federalists, for a variety of reasons, start to collapse as a national party. So we have Jefferson and his more pro French type of policies going into the 1800s. Up until 1806, the British and the Americans are able to really work together. Merchant trade is booming, the American economy is booming, but there are a number of points of tension between the British Empire and the United States, mostly surrounding neutral trade and First Nations affairs that are starting to create problems within the diplomatic relationship.
So could you tell me a little bit more about this map that I've put up on the slideshow here, which shows a portion of Maine?
Yes, one of the agreements that comes out of 1783 is an agreement of what the boundary of Maine would be, and it was set at the St. Croix River. The good news is that people had a generally functional idea of where the St. Croix River entered into the Atlantic. The bad news is that most of what is now northern Maine had not been substantively explored by British or by American officials or map makers. So they were making a boundary that followed the St. Croix all the way up to its headwaters and to the mountains somewhere out there in Maine without having a clear idea of exactly what was out there, where, or whose land claims would be followed, depending on how that was adjudicated. So the caption on the map at the top of it is that their situations of the mountains and lakes are not correctly known. The date's interesting, so 1812. So now we're 30 years beyond the Treaty of Paris, or almost 30 years. They divided up land that they did not know where everything was located. Not unusual in European diplomacy as they look at North American or other colonial lands. But it is certainly interesting that this remains an ongoing irritant in British American negotiations, starting in the 1780s all the way through into the 19th century over where this boundary actually is. It's not fully adjudicated until 1842. So this boundary of where things are or should be end up in a almost 60-year series of negotiations over where the St. Croix River is and what was meant by that label.
So the year 1812 is significant for another reason because we have a third war that now comes into play, the War of 1812. How does that affect what's happening on that coast?
Well, directly, it doesn't. There's an informal treaty. It's not even really a treaty, it's an informal understanding between inhabitants of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and the District of Maine that if there are no hostilities on land by any of the parties, that nobody would instigate any hostilities. So this is supported by a guy by the name of Sir John Sherbrooke, who's the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. And he puts out a proclamation for everybody to see that if the Americans agree to maintain the peace, that he will agree to maintain the peace. So on land, at least, that is what happens from the start of official war in June of 1812 all the way to the summer of 1814. So the War of 1812 is basically canceled as far as the land war in Maine or in the Maritime Provinces is concerned. There is conflict at sea between privateers, units of the Royal Navy and of the American Navy, but at least on land, there is very little interest in war, and there's very little supplies or men to conduct that war if there was an interest.
We have another map here. Tell me a little bit more about this map.
So this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting and the war starts to get a little bit closer to home. So in 1813, there's very serious fighting in what is now Ontario between the United States and the British Empire. One of the problems the British have is that the St. Lawrence is frozen for most of the winter. So starting in October all the way through April or May, the river was closed to the shipping that existed at the time. Icebreaker technology and things like that that keep the river open today just didn't exist. What was needed was a way to be able to move men and material from a year round port like a St. John and to be able to get those men to the front in Ontario. And one of the ways they find to do this is by a snow road. Essentially, they would make a track from Fredericton up the St. John through Madawaska and then down the St. Lawrence that men could walk on at a relatively rapid pace to get from a warm water port all the way to the battlefront in the span of, in this case, 50 days, in the case of the 104th. The 104th being a Newfoundland regiment that made this trek in the winter of 1813. This meant that the British Army could get men to the battlefront over the winter, which was something that, if they depended on the water route up the St. Lawrence, they would not have been able to do.
So Sherbrooke is able to use this new snow road, this route to attack, correct? In September of 1814?
So the 1814 campaign looks a little bit different. So by this time, Napoleon is in exile, and thousands of British troops are starting to come across the Atlantic. So this snow road remains in place, but Sherbrooke, now that he has been reinforced with naval units, with thousands of army troops, is thinking a little bit more ambitious. His plan is still centered on this road, but he's interested in being able to protect it because the boundary is uncertain. It has not been fully explored. However, that old idea of New Ireland comes back around. So the theory is that if a British colony can be reestablished from the Penobscot to the east, what it meant was that this road would be completely protected from possible American attack. So to protect the road, he decides, and with the approval of London, to attack Castine, to reestablish Fort George, to reestablish the Penobscot as the boundary, not only as a colony in its own right, but also as a defense of this road against the Americans.
So how do we get from Sherbrooke at Castine kind of to Maine celebrating it becoming a state in like 1820, correct? So there's a change of hands, crucial change of hands that happens. What
Yes.
swoops in exactly and switches the board?
Well, what ends up happening is that Sherbrooke's campaign in what is now Maine is completely successful. Everything from the Penobscot east goes to the British in the span of 2 weeks. However, in 1814, like we see in 1783, the British are horribly overextended. They had been at war in Europe now for over 2 decades. Taxes were extremely high. The people were exhausted of war. The United States was incapable of conducting war any further. The economy was near collapse, and the banking sector was even near collapse because so much money was going out through Castine and His Majesty's customs there that there was a threat that the United States would run out of money. The United States was not particularly interested in continuing the war. The British Empire was not interested. So they come together on Christmas Eve of 1814 and sign the Treaty of Ghent, which basically says that the boundaries are going to go back to what they were when the war started. So nobody will lose land, nobody will gain land. We're going to go back to the start. Now, the First Nations out in the Great Lakes area, in the Ohio Territory, now they lose pretty significantly from this transaction. as an independent power base, they are significantly impacted. For Maine, things go back to the way they were. However, attitudes had started to change because it was clear that the Massachusetts government, when in crisis, could not effectively administer Maine. The defenses of Maine during 1814 in that campaign were minimal. There were long-standing difficulties with things like taxation and representation. So as we get out of the War of 1812, there's more and more support for statehood. So there's a number of votes that take place, and by 1820, Maine comes in to the Union. Now, part of this was because of larger politics. Maine comes in as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state in that very famous compromise that we see in 1820. So there's some larger national politics in play. However, there are some very significant local pressures that had led to a state of Maine independent from Massachusetts.
So all of these skirmishes and boundaries and wars that we've talked about today, could you summarize, since we introduced it, the concept of there being two key turning points? What would you consider those two key turning points that kept the Down East area from being British North America?
So the two key turning points are two treaties that end war between the British Empire and the United States. So the first being 1783, the end of the Revolution and that agreement to return Maine that had been under British occupation to the United States. The second being 1814, and again, that agreement by an overextended British Empire that is willing to return lands in eastern Maine back to the United States due to other interests in other parts of the globe.
Thank you. So now we are going to switch to any questions participants may have. Please feel free to put those in the chat. I do have one received, which was the area on the map that was unknown and not on the map, was that also considered part that went over in 1814, or did that stay a part of British territories in Canada, or was it part of Massachusetts?
So that was one of those things where the map was not actually very clear on what was out there. So 1814, the first attack of Sherbrooke is in September. The war ends in December. So it's not really adjudicated where that boundary would be. They're still working off of the idea of the St. Croix as the boundary. The question is, where is the St. Croix? If we go back to 1763 and the royal proclamation of that year, which sets the western boundary of Maine, well, that was a boundary set, but nobody knew where that was either. So that is one of those questions that remains open over exactly what is there and which way it would have gone if there was a different political settlement reached.
Thank you. Doesn't seem like we have any other questions from the participants. So thank you so much, Patrick, for joining me this evening and for telling us some of the history of this region and how it could have gone a different way. The theme of 2020 Chebacco is imagining what if, and this is a question that applies really well to this topic. So thank you for being with us.
Well, and thank you for having me.
So coming up on Chebacco Chats next week, Thursday, November 10th at 4:30 p.m., we have Thomas Urquhart with Governor Bernard's failed dream for Southwest Harbor. And here we have the rest of the schedule for the season. You can visit mdihistory.org/Chebacco-chats for the full schedule, the Zoom link, and then links to previous episodes are also on that page. If you have any interest in purchasing a copy of Chebacco Chat or Chebacco, you can also go on our website. If you have any questions, feel free to email info@mdihistory.org. .org. So thank you everyone for being with us this evening, and hopefully you'll join us next Thursday for another Chebacco Chat. Good night.